ready to lead these men. You are ready to become a member of the League of Shadows. But first, you must demonstrate your commitment to justice. Voy!
I'm no executioner.
Your compassion is a weakness your enemies will not share.
That's why it's so important. It separates us from them.
You want to fight criminals. This man is a murderer.
This man should be tried.
By whom? Corrupt bureaucrats? Criminals mock society's laws. You know this better than most.
You cannot lead these men unless you are prepared to do what is necessary to defeat evil.
And where would I be leading these men?
Gotham. As Gotham's favored son, you will be ideally placed to strike at the heart of criminality.
How?
Gotham's time has come. Like Constantinople or Rome before it. The city has become a breeding ground for suffering and injustice. It is beyond saving and must be allowed to die. This is the most important function of the League of Shadows. It is one we performed for centuries. Gotham must be destroyed.
You can't believe in this.
Ra's al Ghul rescued us from the darkest corners of our own hearts. What he asks in return is the courage to do what is necessary.
I will go back to Gotham and I will fight men like this, but I will not become an executioner.
Bruce, please. For your own sake, there is no turning back. What are you doing?
What's necessary, my friend?
Oh, here we are. Today's virtue we're talking about is justice. So justice is, I don't think it's quite as maybe obvious to apply to the psyche as the other two were. Because courage is very much an internal sort of calculation that you have to make. And then temperance, of course, is about not flying off the handle and everything that means. Justice is a whole lot more externally relevant. All right, but I didn't want to get too deep into that because that gets into a lot of stuff like politics and all that. Not there's anything wrong with that, but it's really kind of not the focus here. And of course, the masculine version of this, the flavor that is applied in this case to men, is the other dimension. But if I were to ask in general, what is justice? What are we talking about here? How would you answer that?
Well, it's interesting. You said it's more externally focused because I was thinking about it more cognitively, like giving justice to something, giving something its due.
But yeah, it's typically externally focused, but I think
how
we're going to flip it on the head and
Right.
say, look at this internally as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what does it mean to pursue justice as a virtue? What does it look like to you?
I think it like giving justice to that internal process of courage, giving justice to temperance, right? It's almost like creating a cognitive discipline to say that allowing what is just to come forward, and I think that directly is tied to conscious. like conscience. So being the way I hear a lot of people talk about justice is they talk about the subjective a lot. Like what might be just for me might not necessarily be just for somebody else. But I think it's more along the lines of having that kind of predisposition to a just foundation, and saying that even though these things might be different, um, depending on the individual, allowing that to unfold, and hopefully justice, maybe not, maybe it's not justice for all, but I think that in of itself is just saying that what I want, and I might not be right, allowing that to apply to someone else, right? The other.
Yeah, there seems to be a tension when people talk about justice in the idea of relativism versus absolutism. Like X, Y, Z are just regardless, period. Doesn't matter who you are. Versus the other crowd that says, well, no, everything is context dependent and everything is subjective. And again, I think we're looking at a false dichotomy in that.
Yeah.
And I think it creates all kinds of endless and utterly pointless debates. And the way I would say is, my answer to that dichotomy would be that I do think that what is considered just and right is heavily context dependent, of course. Look how complicated the law is. Not that the law always reflects justice, but and there is a subjective element to it. But there's quite another thing to say that all justice and all right and wrong are entirely subjective and therefore exist entirely in your head. I think we're getting out of the realm of anything useful when we do that, because then anything goes. And if I want to torture people for the lulls and say, well, that's just to me, well, no, it isn't. Right? It is objectively not, sir.
Right.
And so I think there are absolutes, but I don't necessarily know that what they are. That's different. And I think people get really nervous when someone like myself or anyone else says some things are just absolutely right and some things are absolutely wrong. We could give a couple of examples. Genocide, probably not okay.
Not a good idea.
Child abuse, that kind of thing. Now you could say, well, what do these things exactly mean? Blah blah blah. But if we say that it's all subjective or socially constructed, right, our favorite thing, then it's self-refuting. It's not an argument from, well, I just don't like that and I think it's annoying. No, it's an argument from, if anything goes, then my system that says anything does not go also goes. So it's self-refuting. It's an incoherent way of looking at it. So I think that it is a virtue to strive a just society and just world, even if we don't know exactly how that's accomplished, even if we don't know what those values are. And I think we may even never know what those are entirely, because there's limits to human knowledge and understanding. And again, well, if you're going to say there are limits to human understanding, what are they? Well, if I could say that, then I would have an understanding of what the limits and what's beyond those limits are. So I can't say that. So you see how this gets tangled if you're not careful. Very tangled. So, I mean, the long and the short of it is, to me, sometimes you have to just go with the best information you have, right? Back to our sphere of control, and say, what is right? What should I do? And saying that justice is a virtue is a nice global way to say it is something you should be pursuing, because it's within your power to do so. And it is self-evident in its value. Yeah. It also applies to the other three, like you were hinting at before. It sometimes takes courage to pursue justice, and being temperate is just. Being courageous is just. Seeking wisdom is just. And I offer those as just self-evident truths. I don't know why anyone would argue with those things, but I'm sure somebody would. But if you're going to do that, you're outside of a virtue ethics,
right?
In my not so humble opinion. So I think they interlock.
Mm-hmm.
So then our pursuit of justice, if we're going to stay within the Stoic framework, should be focused on that which can be influenced towards that. And as a therapist, right? So let's break this down to the psychology here, and those in training and everyone. We always run into people who much of their suffering is caused because they believe the world should be fair and just. So this is the kind of the dark side to that, because you can look around you within 2 seconds and recognize that it manifestly is not that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. So, and then what are you going to do? Well, the pathological way to respond to that is to fret and worry and carry on and turn yourself inside out, or get enraged and scream and carry on. None of that stuff does any good. It doesn't fix it. And in fact, it may never be fixed. Back to virtue. Okay, well, what can I do within my control then?
Yeah.
Can I make fair within my little corner of the universe? That's, I think, the nuance that the Stoics offered. Rather than rail at the unfairness of the world and ruminate on that ad nauseum to the point where you're depressed and anxious and miserable.
Yeah.
How many times have you had to try to dislodge that belief system from folks you've been working with, clients?
Oh yeah.
Or whatever.
Yeah.
Right.
A great example. I was working with this young man, and he was in a situation where he was told that he needed to do something, but he was honestly, that frustration was almost projecting onto everybody else that was trying to help him in that situation, and he was getting angry. And I said, what is within your control to change this situation? Because it sounds like you're not giving, and I didn't use the term justice, but it really, that's what it was. You're not giving your feelings, your emotions, this impetus to kind of change your situation justice. You're not allowing that action to come forward. And then, it's simultaneously, I think, in a lot of therapy, you can take the route of understanding where that neurosis came from, right? So like, why was that block there? Why was he caught between acting and not acting? And then also, really, what is kind of the solution focused going forward? How do you act and give those emotions, give yourself justice in the world? People in relationships, men in relationships, if somebody betrays you, what does that mean? Are you going to give that justice? Are you going to allow that to continue to happen? Are you going to do something about it? And I think this is where you just said it, like temperance also comes in. Knowing those boundaries and knowing, okay, how am I bringing this forward? And is it destructive? Is it generative? Is it both potentially? So justice, it is very much, it isn't necessarily always relative, but it is definitely context dependent. And I do like that the Stoics bring it back in instead of looking out at the world, rage quitting on everything and saying everything sucks.
Right. Yeah. That's a good example is over the many last couple of decades, 3 or 4 decades, I guess now, I've been watching people complain about the system, for example, and they say, well, I can't make it ahead in the world. I can't accomplish A, B, and C. The system is rigged against me, so forth and so on. And then someone else will come along who's successful to some measure or another and say, you're full of crap. You just need to work harder, and all that kind of thing. And that draws further controversy, because people will say, well, you're just supporting this broken system that's completely unfair. And what I've noticed about these arguments, which tend to be between left and right, ends of this political spectrum, and you can place who goes who more appropriately without really much effort. But the problem is both of them are talking about two different things. One person is saying the system is unfair. There's all of this income inequality, and there's racial problems and all that kind of stuff. And another person is saying you're just making excuses for not getting further in life and sitting there complaining, and you need to just work harder. and take control of your own life. And in fact, those two things are not mutually exclusive, right? I can take control of my life. I can try to strive for more if that's what I really want, and all those things, and also recognize that the system is not really fair. It's not set up in a way that is, I mean, the buying power of the dollar, for example, the minimum wage hasn't changed in like 30 years or something, or it's changed very little compared to the cost of living. Okay, that's a great way to look at things. What ain't fair? And I could look at that and go, well, there's an excuse for me to not do anything, and say, I'm just going to sit here and stew and all that, and you'll draw fire from those right wingers. But what I'm saying is, none of that is going to help you at all. The only thing that's going to help you is say, look at what's within your control, do what you can with it, and that's literally all you can do. And there's no shame in that.
Yeah.
And part of what is within your control is, if it is in your constitution, to be an activist, to speak out against those things that aren't fair. Try to make a change to the degree that you can. But you see how those two things, they just like talking right past each other.
Yeah.
And all of this is tangled up in the idea of justice in terms of social justice,
right,
economic justice, all that kind of stuff. That's the external version.
Yeah, I agree. It's interesting you mentioned that. I do like the old adage, instead of giving man a fish, teach a man to fish. And to the people that say, consistently say, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, it's just like, well, why don't you help, teach them how to do that, right? Because if you're successful in life, it doesn't necessarily have to come from a system or a government organization. Why can't culture be built around human beings interacting with one another in a way that's generative, especially amongst men? And, we were talking kind of about this yesterday a little bit, is that the expectation is almost within our culture. It is that dichotomy and that polarization is so far pushed to both sides that people don't realize that, yes, all right, there are certain systemic things that are going on. And yes, people do have the capacity to change things within their own lives, but that requires people to coming together, especially with men, and saying,
ideally,
yeah, right. And if there's a 20-something-year-old homeless guy on the street, you can look at that individual all you want and say, he's just not doing enough in his life. He's lazy. He's this. He's that. That could be true. It could also be true that he was, dealt the shit end of the stick, so to speak.
Yeah.
And having a more positive male role model to help him pull out of that.
Yeah.
That could be something there too. I agree, man. Those talking heads really, they're just talking around each other. Two sides that make no sense, really.
Yeah, I mean, if that's a consistent message that we keep arriving at here, is that the current zeitgeist is just polarized shouting.
Yeah.
And it's encouraged with this whole clickbait culture and all that, rage clicking and so forth. But yeah, well, and in the context of that debate, there's an underlying assumption too, which I would question, which is that every man is for himself. That's not how humans evolved. That's certainly not how human males evolved at all. There is quite a bit of interesting evolutionary evidence to suggest that one of the major adaptations was males banding together in coalitional alliances, probably before Homo sapiens. This was established, something along the lines of what gorilla males do sometimes as brothers and siblings. They'll do that, but more complex than that in proto-humans. And in other words, we're supposed to be banding together. We're supposed to be working towards a common goal, for those instincts to kick in, for the genome to recognize that and go, yes, here we are. And that's why you see so many of these, gurus, the gathering men around them saying, follow me, blah, blah, blah. And that energy gets activated, right? And I don't think there's a whole lot of awareness about it. And it's, we can do this together. We're the, team us, etc. The military fosters the heck out of that because it works. As in the military environment, it's that or death. So they're going to use what works. So, but when the economic system says it's every man for himself, it's every nuclear family versus every other nuclear family, that leads to alienation, and a lot of this achievement-based value system, the only thing that's worthy of you is what you've achieved monetarily. That's so utterly toxic.
Yeah.
Rather than camaraderie, community, common values, that kind of stuff, which is probably the more natural state for Homo sapiens, for men especially. And women do this too, but in the male version of this instinct is banding together typically towards task-oriented, goal-oriented activities in action, which aligns with those proclivities that we talked about in the first two videos, right? Our foundation. And the mentoring plays into that with the hunting bands or gathering. So in hunter-gatherer lifestyles, the men typically will band together on hunting parties. Or of course, that evolves naturally into war parties when you're dealing with conflicting hunter-gatherer groups, although they don't normally go to war against each other because in the environment where that was the dominant culture type, most of the time you could just migrate away from the conflict. But if you're evolved for hunting bands, which are groups of men gathered together to kill stuff, well, that works to kill humans too. So it was, naturally adapted to jump into that. But that's not the whole picture. The other side of this is that food processing, which I think generally speaking the women would handle, is very complex, requires a lot of coordinated activity, requires a lot of instruction and language capability, because humans tend to eat things that other animals can't by taking them and processing the heck out of them with tools and doing all of this stuff to get at the nutrients and everything else. So that's the other piece of this. And so that might be where that evolved in, the kind of the feminine flavor of this cooperativity. The point of all of this is that it's not every man for himself. That's an artificial situation that we have. And that gets us away from justice because it says, who cares about justice as long as you come out on top?
Right.
So it's all connected in this sort of grand way with our whole history, I think.
Yeah.
So, so there's a kind of a famous rant by George Carlin. Before he died, this is one of his later rants about rights. I don't know if you heard that one. You don't have rights, you have privileges, and he would go on and on and on about people are always talking about their rights. You don't have any rights, and it's hilarious. It's cynical and dark, but that was how he was. But it did make me question, as I was thinking about justice, well, how does that play into it? Because it does. I think what he was tapping into was just a tendency for everybody to complain about how their rights are being violated and this is my right and all that kind of stuff. And this is George Carlin. He wasn't having it. It's, to me, it's just it's more polarization and distraction, because it's kind of like trying to play the trump card. Well, this is my right. But what Carlin's point was, it says who? It says society, so they don't exist. They're conjured up out of thin air from the government or from the culture or whatever it is.
Right.
There's some kernel of truth to that. But can't we just avoid all of that talk by asking, what does a just man or what does a just society do? It's talking about rights is great and wonderful, but at the end of the day, it is still a negotiation and a discussion about what is right and what isn't. Not, I have a right to this, which then somehow appeals to some inalienable, infinite authority somewhere, which may be out there, but I don't know exactly what it is. You know, so I don't know. That might just be a sidebar. Or
no, I think that's a great. Well, Carlin was a genius, comedic genius. One, but two, like I think that
hilarious, angry, but really fun.
Yeah,
angry
two,
dude.
Who is it? Lita Cosmides, and then Tubi. Yeah, in 2018 they came out with a paper. It was on the kind of innateness and morality. And I think it really was kind of, it's stemming a lot from also Panksepp's work on the 7 basic instinctual systems. But I read that paper, phenomenal paper. I've quoted it multiple times in school, but they were pretty much describing that there is this kind of social innateness, this evolutionary innateness to kind of certain moral acts. And those habits are deeply embedded in our genome and who we are psychologically. And I think that, and it really does talk about these collective issues. I think in the paper they reference, they're talking about how if an individual who's injured prior to that injury would still would produce a lot, right? Was very active in the community and collectively was very generous. During that injury, they'd be very well taken care of. Where if an individual was taking advantage of others and they got injured, they'd probably be left in the dust to a certain extent, because the collective would know, hey, listen, like, you're injured, you're kind of like dragging us along here, and you really wouldn't contribute prior to that. So you gotta realize that we're not really going to help you out at this point.
Your insurance has been denied.
Yeah, exactly. And there were no laws, there were no it was just this kind of innate social contract that stemmed from an innate morality, in a sense. And
you don't even get laws until you see cultures where people actually need them. Before that, everyone knows what's right and what should be done, period, because that's the tradition that's been handed down. Once you get a society that's changed significantly enough, whether it's through migration or merging or conquest or whatever it is, people then start to argue and dispute what is and should not be this, that, and the other. And that all of a sudden now you've got a need to write them down so that you can refer to them as if that's some kind of, inviolate, godlike thing. But at the end of the day, the genome is really, I think, the actual source of a lot of this stuff. I'd have to agree with that. I haven't read that paper, but I've read a lot of their stuff. And clearly, and big influence on my own work. And that's the authority I think people are really getting at. Even people who do evil things, with rare exception, will spin it as a good thing, as the end justifies the means, or I'm really aiming towards this. I was actually trying to do something good with this act, blah, blah, blah. And you get your antisocials that don't care, but there's a reason for them too. There's papers on that too as well, free rider hypothesis and all that. But yeah, and in a place where there is no legal system, I think you're right that court of public opinion is what winds up happening. Well, you didn't contribute that much and now you're injured, so good luck to you. Yeah, hope you don't get eaten by a tiger, brah.
Yeah, right. Good luck with those. Yeah, good luck. Good luck.
So is that just? Is that not just? You could get all tangled up in that question.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, it's more about what worked and what survived. And that's a tough one, because nature, if you look to nature and say, well, that's where we get all of our rules for what is just, and then that's a naturalistic fallacy. So you got to watch that. So we still have to have our philosophers around to really try to nail this stuff down.
Yeah.
And the recognition that much of our moral intuitions comes from nature does not necessarily mean that those intuitions are truly morally correct. It plays into it in a complicated way that I don't know if anyone's ever been able to sort out.
Yeah.
How does, okay, so then if we do make an argument that such and such is just, isn't that still getting the influence? Of course it is. So I don't know. I don't know how that works, but we got to start somewhere.
Yeah.
We have to start somewhere.
The scope of the conversation. Yeah, because I think the cultural conversations, especially when you have the size of the organism that is humanity now, right? The cultural conversations around justice typically revolve around also equality, right? And those two things going hand in hand, where I don't think they're necessarily the case, right? But I think that's where a lot of the kind of philosophical social construct conversations are right now.
Oh, absolutely. And equality itself is another troublesome concept, because what do you mean by equal?
Yeah.
I mean, I hate to be pedantic about it, but equal does not mean identical. If you have two groups of people, men and women, or different ethnicities and things like that, they're not equal, and in the sense of being identical. But it's easy to say something like that and get misinterpreted as a racist and all that sort of stuff. But that's not at all the case. It's about what is fair given the differences.
Yeah.
So is it fair to make allowances for women in the workplace, for example, because they have needs that men do not have? I think, yes, it is fair. Is it equal? No, it's not equal. But it's fair. And maybe that's part of the problem, getting back to the idea of the every man for himself attitude that we have and the hyper individualism that we have. It amplifies this conversation and the energy behind it 100-fold, because now I've got to not only look out for myself, but advocate for what's fair to me, and to hell with everybody else. So all of a sudden everybody's a lawyer, arguing their case and trying to get one up on everyone else. And it's not really about justice anymore. It's about who has the power. Gosh, that sounds so familiar.
It's yep. Yeah.
Are we talking about Washington here or the individual psyche?
You're hitting a nodal point on that one.
Boop. There's the nodal point.
Yeah, okay. I think I was going to ask you. So if justice and equality are in these kind of social conversations right now, the applicability of it to the individual, because what I've seen is there are a lot of guru men's groups out there that are, again, very individualistic, very heavily inundated with kind of power complexes that they're completely unconscious of.
Rampant narcissism.
Right. And I've heard men say things like, if I present a question, like, if you saw a woman in distress, right, would you help her in some way? And there's always like just a kind of a cornucopia, a plethora of answers, but certain answers are, well, no, why would I do that? Right? Why, or even a woman or even another man in distress, why would I even approach that situation? And I think usually the answers are like, I might be perceived a certain way, or why do they deserve my help type thing. And I think that's more of a problem now than it ever has been.
Yeah.
And it's, I think you're right in saying it revolves a lot around these kind of power ideas. And instead of I think instead of showing what's just and believe in and being an exemplar of that in your own life, you do have these cultural ideas now that are saying just recede into yourself and just and be in your own head. You don't need anybody else. You don't need this. You don't need that. Go your own way, right?
Yeah.
And it's very dangerous. It's very dangerous.
It's also stupid.
Yeah.
All right. I said what I said. So yeah, I see what you're talking about. I think, honestly, if we were to look at this at a systemic level, we're talking about lack of trust. These individuals are told and fed this narrative, all of us growing up in any sort of westernized nation are told it's all on you. You've got to, get as far as you can. get at the top of the heap, blah, 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 and it's all on you. And our mental health system is set up the exact same way. You're mentally ill, which is your neurons and your neurotransmitters and your cognitions, and you need to fix it.
Mm.
And isn't that convenient that we have all these, various treatments available for you for the right price? Rather than fixing the society that's contributing to the issue. That's another conversation, but we raise people in this, and then we say, you're on your own. So when you propose this thought experiment, well, they're gonna feel. I think what drives those narcissistic and obnoxious responses, if I'm going to try to understand that and really do anything about it other than gripe about it, I'm going to say they don't trust that the same thing would be done for them. They don't feel a part of a community. They don't feel integral to any sort of group. They feel utterly alone. So that's actually kind of a quasi-rational response to that. Why should I help them? They don't care about me. Why should I care about them? And they get angry because they feel like people are pushing them and saying you should feel ashamed if you don't care about those people. While at the same time, we're fed this other narrative that says, get as high at top of the heap and to hell with everybody you step on.
Yep.
So yeah, you get all of this confusion and anger. Not very constructive.
No.
But what the point you raised though is extremely important here for us, which is, yes, the external justice conversation is a mess. We're not going to fix that today, but what we can do is address, how do I bring that within? What does inner justice look like? What about interpersonal justice? Right, that's where the meat of the conversation really needs to stay, I think, to be constructive. Well, how would you describe that phrase, inner justice? What does that mean to you?
Justice. I think it really is. That's a tough one. I think inner justice is.
You mentioned it before.
Yeah, an allowance.
Justice to your own emotions, for example.
Giving yourself, right, the big I, its due, right, and allowing that to come forward, but also having the wherewithal and the know-how and the fortitude to understand also that when you do allow that to come forward, you might not necessarily always be right.
Yeah.
A lot of the times you could actually be wrong. So the justice, exactly. Expect to be wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Humility, that's not one of the virtues, but it probably should be.
Yeah, right.
That's maybe it's part of temperance, maybe.
Right.
Yeah, temper the ego. Oh, that's definitely in the temperance. But absolutely. Not only be fair to yourself, but also hold yourself up to the just standard as well at the same time. Yep. If I catch myself doing something intemperate, if I don't know, yell at the dog because he peed on the floor, and that doesn't accomplish anything, and except maybe scares the dog. Right. So that would be intemperate. It's just of me to say, okay, I did that in the heat of the moment. I lost my temper, but I shouldn't be doing stuff like that. So I need to work on how I can avoid doing things like that. I'm seeking justice, seeking temperance in that moment. And that can apply to all sorts of things. But it does not mean sitting there and wallowing in, oh, I'm so horrible.
No.
That's not just to you. I've had this, you've probably experienced this as well, patients who push themselves so hard for everybody except themselves. And they give and give and give and give. And they wind up training everybody around them to take and take and take without thinking. Oh, well, they'll just always be there to help me. And then they get burnt out and they get resentful and they get anxious and they get angry and they don't give voice to those feelings at all. And they wind up a mess. But that is unjust. And they think the opposite. They think, well, I'm supposed to help other people, right? That's good. Yes. But you also deserve the exact same treatment. That's inner justice, I think.
Yeah.
That's one of the elements of it.
Yeah.
And that applies in terms of relationships, interpersonal justice. And this where it gets a little trickier, because the other person is their own human being, right? If you're a straight male like myself and you're in a relationship with a female, I have to recognize we are not identical. Therefore, it is fair of me to listen and assess her needs, balanced with mine, and we can come to this way of understanding without it turning into a shit show. If I pursue justice, if I pursue temperance, and of course your partner does too. You have both, right? I mean, it doesn't matter how amazing you are if your partner is just not going to engage. Then what you have to do is disengage.
That's justice in and of itself.
That is justice.
You know,
It is to yourself, not lingering and on false hope and all of that sort of stuff. As much as you just don't want to do that. But big part of Stoicism, and also about what I think we're developing here, something that has been through the ages emphasized by many different sort of masculine traditions, if you will, warrior ethos, etc., is radical acceptance of the world as it is.
Mm-hmm.
And isn't it funny that humility finds itself into all those knightly codes and the Bushido and all of that stuff? Because that's the same thing. Partially the same thing. It's talking about radical acceptance of one's own imperfection.
Yeah.
And if, like I said, if you go into this knowing you're going to screw up, and I accept that, I will strive to avoid it, but I am not infinitely powerful to avoid it. There's not a way that I can literally avoid making every single mistake. There's no way. So I know it's going to happen. I'm going to prepare for it mentally. So fairness towards self and others should be identical. That's where it is the same. It is, because otherwise that's not just.
Yeah.
I mean, fairness, right? So not treating the other person as if they were you. That's not gonna work, because they're not. But the level of attention you pay to what is fair to me as opposed to them, that should be balanced.
Yeah.
I think that's how inner justice should be pursued.
I like that.
You need that with courage, temperance, and wisdom, all three.
Yeah.
I have some quotes for you that I think speak to this issue. My son shared these with me. He's a huge fan of the Stoics as well. Actually, both of my boys are.
Nice.
Marcus Aurelius says, if anyone tells you that a certain person speaks ill of you, don't make excuses about what is said of you, but answer, he was ignorant of my other faults. Otherwise, he would not have mentioned these alone. Now, that one requires a little context, I think, because it might be interpreted as let people walk all over you. But that's not really what Marcus is getting at here, if you read the Meditations, which I know you have. In this, I read this as accepting the faults that you have. There's so much anguish and sturm and drang caused by people not able to accept the fact that they are imperfect. Mm-hmm. A lot of folks that wind up in therapy, people who think they're perfect, they don't come to therapy. If they think they're perfect and they're just oblivious to anything that they're doing that's wrong, they don't show up in therapy. Yeah. So what we get on the other side of that, people that want to be perfect, but they aren't, and then that causes them all kinds of anguish. When that's outside the sphere of control.
Yeah.
It's literally outside. It's completely pointless to pursue that. What's the next best thing then? The pursuit of excellence, the acceptance of mistakes. And when folks criticize, it helps you to avoid intemperance when you look at it like Marcus is looking at. Of course, he was the emperor of Rome, like the most powerful man in the whole planet. He's going to have people criticizing him.
Nonstop.
Obviously, nonstop. And he was obviously a very thoughtful man. And this was his way of handling that without imploding. He was extremely tough, I think, as you had to be.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think you said it best. You said strive for it.
Right.
And yes. Like you, yesterday you you said something. Oh, what was it? You were talking about ideals and heroes, right?
Yes.
And it's not that you or anyone can ever live up to that perfection. You can't live up to the perfection of the virtue, but it's if it is in the line of, if you look at these as the kind of top end of action that is derived from something much deeper, you'll never necessarily get there, and you shouldn't expect yourself to be. But if you strive for it, if you keep striving, that's what life is, right? It's an essential
Exactly.
part of it. And being better on the journey, being better every day, maybe not even every day, but striving to be better is an essential part of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. There was part of, we haven't talked about Man of Steel, the movie,
Hmm.
but there's a great part there where Jor-El is encouraging Superman
Hmm.
right before he learns how to fly, and he says, the people will follow you, they'll stumble, but then, you'll lead them to the light, or something
Hmm.
inspiring like that. And of course, it's Russell Crowe saying it, so you're like, yes,
Right,
I'm
right, right.
with you. He's very charismatic. But that's kind of what we're getting at is, you can't be Superman, but that's not the point. The point is that Superman exists as an ideal to strive towards, if possible. And if we don't have those, then it's a lot harder to accomplish that, because well, what am I striving for? So heroes like that are unmitigated, purely heroic characters like Aragorn, for example, are useful for masculine development and feminine development, of course, because of the ease with which you can imagine them and strive towards them. They're resonant, they're sticky. I can go, well, what would Beowulf do? Yeah, or Jesus, or any of these characters, that are extremely idealized.
Yeah.
But so that's Marcus. That's our quote from Marcus. I got one from Epictetus, the other end of the social spectrum, as Epictetus was a slave. Remember, it is not enough to be hit or insulted to be harmed. You must also believe that you are being harmed. If someone succeeds in provoking you, realize that your mind is complicit in the provocation, which is why it's essential that we do not respond impulsively to impressions. Take a moment before reacting, and you'll find it easier to maintain control. So that's another interesting perspective on this same sort of thing. And I'm focusing on, like, what if people are insulting you, but the injustice of that is what might get us fired up, say.
Yeah.
But it all boils down to the same sort of principle. In this instance, he's talking about what part are you playing in this, because that's the part you can control. The other person's opinion I can possibly influence, but it's not guaranteed. So you do your due diligence to attempt, and if it doesn't work, then you have to disengage.
Yeah.
Logic.
Yeah.
So I think that you can boil these two down to, if others are being unjust towards you, like all of these guys that are angry and following the gurus that are telling them exactly what they want to hear, they're fomenting the rage. They're saying, yes, you should be outraged. You should hate women. You should hate society. You should hate the government. You should hate everything and everybody. I'm saying, I don't think that's so great. Instead, if you feel that you're being treated unjustly, the answer is not self-attack or necessarily counter-strike in equal measure. I think it's a tempered response, defending your integrity and addressing the problem directly within your power. If you can tailor it to that ideal, then that's pursuing the virtues, as I see it. And I could very well be wrong about that. I could be in need of modification someday. I don't know, but that's what I've got today.
Yeah. No, I think that's great. I think it's great. It's again, it's what is the context of the situation you find yourself in, and doing that situation and yourself and the other justice.
Yes.
It's sometimes it hurts, sometimes it's not necessarily sometimes what is like, especially when it comes to just somebody who's being unjust towards you, so on and so forth. I don't think it's ever necessarily an absolute. It could be true, it could be not true, but that truth doesn't necessarily mean it's wholly true, right? And I think it's knowing the difference.
Yeah,
You know,
it's worth asking, is there at least some truth to this
yeah,
that I need to examine
yeah,
fairly, right? And some people cave in to that sort of introspective exercise because they don't have the resilience that, you know, we all really kind of need growing up, that we learn, that we absorb from others. And if you are one of those folks, the first thing you got to do is recognize it.
Mhm.
And, you know, that's something I've had to work on for many years for various and sundry reasons. We won't get into that, but it is something that it takes work, but it's something you can work on. So the military was helpful for some of that,
Mm,
because they definitely foster resilience, because they can't afford to have people that aren't unresilient.
yeah,
You know, and so a lot of what they do is directed around that, and it's, you know, it's can be seen as harsh and cruel and all that kind of stuff, but you know, we've talked about that before. But it if you are vulnerable to that, that's not fair either to you, so you have to address that as well. You have to
yeah,
say, okay, if I get criticized and I immediately leap to, oh, I'm at fault, I'm wrong, I suck. If you know you do that, as soon as you recognize that, you have to stop doing that. Right? You have to stop doing that because it's unjust, right? If you're going to pursue the virtues, you have to say, fairness to me is also important
yeah,
as fairness to others. It's
right,
equally important because apart from that toxic narrative of every man for himself, we're supposed to be helping each other, and we're all on the same team. We're supposed to be,
yeah,
you know. And I really, the more and more that I think about this and discuss it with you and other folks, the more I think that underlying framing of every man for himself and the disconnection of community and all that is behind a lot of it.
yeah.
It creates these narcissistic defenses. Wouldn't you agree?
Oh, I absolutely agree. I've
You see
fallen
that as
victim
well.
to it myself, you know, like, and
Yeah, it's hard not to.
it's hard not to, man. It's hard not to, but you know, something that I've learned from you, these conversations has been, especially in regards to justice, it's like be, being nobly just in your understanding of humility and also your own actions and your own power, right? And I think that that's very much something that's needed, and it's needed in a collective way, right?
Yeah,
Amongst men, like having conversations about that again, having conversations about those codes, where they come from, and really being not a perfect exemplar of it, but a striving practitioner, you know?
yeah, exactly. Right. And I think of it as kind of like a martial arts class.
Yeah,
You've got white belts and you've got black belts, but they're all there towards a common goal, which is to improve each other, not to beat the crap out of each other. Right. Some schools are like that, I guess. What, Cobra Kai? Right?
Cobra Kai. I was about to say,
I
right
read your
there,
mind.
right there, right there. I'm like, oh,
Right. But
Cobra
we're more
Kai.
like Mr. Miyagi, right? We're
Yeah,
trying to strive for something more like that, more
yeah,
generative.
yeah, yeah,
You know, but building strength, building, you know, skill and adaptive capacity, right? So martial arts is aimed at being able to manage a difficult situation. So it's resilience building. That's
yeah.
what it is. And we're just doing that, and it's like mental martial arts. If you think of it that way, I think a lot of men would resonate with that idea.
Mm,
Learning how to, you know, fend off all of these threats to the integrity of the self.
right,
Yeah.
right.
All right. Well, that's
Well,
it.
good stuff.
Let's
Good
stop
stuff.
on that. That's a pretty good note.
Yeah, yeah. Mental martial arts. Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely, definitely. All right, sir. Well,
All right.
thank you. Thank you for having me.
Next on the
As
agenda
always,
is the big one, wisdom.
wisdom.
Hmm.
Wisdom it is. Wisdom it is.
See
All right. Have a good one, everybody. See you later.
you later, 4 fans.